In this video, you will learn about contractor site compliance responsibilities under the Clean Water Act. The portion of the Clean Water Act that addresses construction activities is known as the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or more simply, NPDES. So, the NPDES addresses stormwater discharges and requires a permit and the use of controls to prevent pollution. We'll look at some of these controls in a minute. You might ask if these rules cover all construction sites, and the answer would be that they apply to all sites of 1 acre or more, and even smaller sites if they are part of a larger development. For example, the construction of a Chick-fil-A on an outparcel, a small outparcel in a larger shopping center. Well, why do we have the NPDES requirements? Well, let's look at the history for a bit first. The NPDES requirements have been around since 1972. However, construction site enforcement was minimal until about 2001. Contractors, for the most part, weren't aware of the rules or generally ignored them. However, in 2001 and again in 2005, the EPA and the Federal Department of Justice targeted Walmart commercial construction sites for non-compliance and levied several $million of fines on each occurrence. As a result of this and other ongoing enforcement actions, contractors and developers now have a clear understanding of their responsibilities and the potential financial penalties. Here are some examples of violations. In the upper right, sediment-laden stormwater is being discharged directly off the site and into an adjoining stream at this Nashville project. And in the lower left, we see sediment clogging a stormwater inlet by the orange arrow, if you can spot it, at this Orlando site. This next picture, also in Florida, is looking down into a stormwater drainage structure. This stuff was all headed out to the St. Johns River and eventually to the Atlantic Ocean. Here are a few related terms that we should probably learn. We already discussed EPA and NPDES. The delegated entity is interesting because the federal government made the law, but the various state governments are delegated and responsible for its implementation. Well, sort of. Keep in mind that your sites can be inspected by the federal EPA at any time as well as by the state delegated entity. Okay, let's change hats for a minute and look at terms that relate to our responsibilities as contractors. Remember we talked a little earlier about controls? Well, the Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan, or SWIP for short, is where the site-specific controls are designed and designated for each site. The SWIP is both a written document and probably several plan sheets in the construction documents. The NOI is pretty straightforward. It is the document that is filed along with the SWIP to obtain the permit and commence work on the construction site. Now back to controls for a second. The physical controls are materials and methods, and these are known as BMPs, or Best Management Practices. Stabilization is the term given to the establishment of a permanent grass or ground cover of vegetation at the end of a project. And finally, the notice of termination is filed with the delegated entity at the completion of all earth disturbance activities and the final stabilization. Okay, let's take a closer look at BMPs. A minute ago, we said that BMPs are the materials and methods used on the construction site in compliance with the SWIP. These BMPs are divided into 3 groups. The first group are probably the ones you may have seen on construction sites. And we're talking about silt fences, hay bales, temporary grassing, washing the wheels of trucks as they leave the site, sediment basins and ponds, etc. As you might appreciate, after that image of the stormwater structure in Florida full of trash, waste management is also one of the BMP groups. And in addition to waste management, hazardous waste is the third category. Okay, so let's take a look then at some BMP examples. As we mentioned, every SWIP will have plan sheets detailing the initial BMPs to be used, just like this one, and this was one of several sheets in this particular set of plans. In addition, here are 3 images of actual BMPs. Upper left we see inlet protection, and we see silt fence on the lower left. This is actually a reinforced silt fence. It has chicken wire behind it. And then in the lower right we see a floating turbidity barrier, and it's doing a good job in keeping the turbidity contained in this lake. Note that this slide is labeled Owner-Contractor Responsibilities. Let's look at this as a project timeline. So we're about to start a new project. We said that the SWIP is the site-specific documentation that sets forth how we intend to manage pollution prevention at our site. Obviously, we need this in place before we can start work. Note that the SWIP is usually created by the owner's engineer as part of the project design process. An important requirement is that the SWIP must be maintained on the project site and be made available to anyone, including the general public, who asks to see it. With the completed SWIP in hand, it can be filed with the NOI to initiate the permit and begin earth disturbance activities. So now we have the start of construction on the site. And the first thing that's done on the site is the installation then of the BMPs. Note that work cannot start until the filing has been completed. BMPs installed. Once the BMPs have been installed, full-scale construction activities can begin. But during the course of construction, the site must be inspected weekly and after rain events by a qualified inspector. Usually this is a state-certified inspector, and inspection records must be kept and again made available to the public if requested. Now this part is important. The contractor is responsible for maintenance of the BMPs, and if any discrepancies are noted in the weekly inspections, they must be corrected prior to the next weekly inspection. If they're not corrected, this is a violation. So what if a BMP just isn't getting the job done? And here's an example from a project in Atlanta, and as we see, the multiple rows of reinforced silt fence are just not getting the job done. So here's the deal. The contractor is not off the hook if what the engineer designed in the SWIP is not working. The contractor is required to modify the SWIP documents, just use a pen or a pencil, and escalate to a more effective and usually more expensive BMP to solve the problem. The green line then illustrates the responsibility to update the SWIP. It's a requirement that the SWIP always reflect current site conditions. Once construction is completed, final stabilization can be done. Then, construction under the terms of the permit is completed, the NOT is filed, and then responsibilities under the NPDES have been completed, except for a 3-year record-keeping requirement. Okay, it's time to summarize. Virtually all construction sites are subject to the NPDES provision of the Clean Water Act. The federal government has assigned management and enforcement of the states of the Act to the states as delegated entities. However, the federal government can still step in anytime they feel like it. Contractors have site-specific compliance and accountability responsibilities under the NPDES.